The paper towels were missing. Standing in her pristine kitchen, Lauren Almeida's hand froze on the pantry door. Just yesterday, she had stocked 12 fresh rolls. Now only 2 remained. In any other household, this might have been a minor inconvenience. But in Jennifer Dulos's carefully organized world, it was the first thread that would unravel a tapestry of lies, leading to multiple deaths and exposing a criminal empire no one could have imagined existed. Lauren glanced around the immaculate kitchen, morning sunlight streaming through the bay windows. Jennifer's untouched tea sat on the marble counter, still warm. Her granola bar remained wrapped beside it, part of a morning routine Lauren had witnessed hundreds of times over the past 6 years. But Jennifer's purse lay sprawled on the floor, its contents scattered as if dropped in haste. Another disruption in a household that ran like clockwork. As Jennifer's nanny and personal assistant, Lauren knew every detail of the family's routine. 5 children to coordinate, endless activities to manage, a household that demanded precision. Jennifer thrived on order, using it like armor against the chaos that had invaded her life since filing for divorce. But today, something was wrong. Lauren could feel it in the still air of the empty house. The missing paper towels would later seem prophetic, the first sign of someone cleaning up evidence that would lead detectives through 5 states, uncover 3 murders, and expose a criminal web that had been growing beneath the polished surface of suburban wealth for over a decade. But at that moment, Lauren just stood there, her hand still on the pantry door, as the first whispers of fear began to creep in. She reached for her phone to call Jennifer, not knowing she was about to become part of one of the most shocking criminal cases in Connecticut history. Sarah's world emerged in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in Jennifer's kitchen. That same morning, Sarah Thompson stood in her corner office at Sterling and Price Marketing, Manhattan's skyline gleaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. At 42, she had everything she'd spent her life pursuing: executive position, perfect marriage, social status that would have made her teenage self dizzy with pride. Mrs. Thompson. Her assistant hovered in the doorway. The Callahan Group presentation is ready for your review. Sarah nodded, smoothing her Armani suit. The Callahan account had doubled their revenue last year, though something about Marcus Callahan always made her uneasy. David assured her he was just old money eccentric. David seemed to know everyone worth knowing. Her phone buzzed, a text from her husband, running late tonight. Client dinner. Don't wait up. She frowned slightly. These late nights were becoming more frequent, but David's success demanded sacrifice. His consulting firm had grown exponentially over the past 5 years, their life expanding with it. She glanced at the photo on her desk, their wedding day 12 years ago. David's dark hair untouched by gray then, his smile radiating the confidence that had first drawn her to him at that Yale mixer. She'd been a scholarship student, he'd come from money, but something had clicked between them instantly. The memory of her own parents' bitter divorce had made Sarah determined to build something different. A marriage of equals, built on trust and shared ambition. They'd succeeded beyond her wildest dreams: the Colonial in Greenwich, summer home in the Hamptons, membership at the country club that would have once seemed as distant as the moon. Sarah. Emma, David's younger sister and Sarah's closest friend, appeared in her doorway. Still on for lunch. Over salads at their usual place, Emma chatted about her latest legal cases, but Sarah was distracted. Last night's incident kept nagging at her. David had come home past midnight, tie askew, smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume. When she'd mentioned it, he'd gotten defensive, almost angry. So unlike him, it had left her unsettled. Earth to Sarah. Emma waved her fork. You okay? Fine. Just tired. Sarah forced a smile. David's been working late a lot. Something flickered across Emma's face. Concern? But before Sarah could analyze it, her phone buzzed again. Another text from David. Need to cancel weekend plans. Emergency business in Columbus. Columbus. Like 3 weeks ago. And the month before that. Always Columbus. I should get back, Sarah said, gathering her things. Big presentation tomorrow. But instead of returning to the office, she found herself walking, mind churning. The perfect life she'd built felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble catching light, beautiful, but one touch away from shattering. That evening, their echoing house felt too large, too empty. Sarah wandered from room to room, noting little things she'd overlooked before. David's home office drawer, always locked now. The second phone he thought she didn't know about. Credit card statements he'd started having sent to his office. In the guest room closet, reaching for a serving platter, her hand brushed something unfamiliar. A plain brown showbox, pushed far back in the corner. For a moment, she hesitated. Trust had been the foundation of their marriage. But something about that box pulled at her like a loose thread in an expensive sweater. She pulled it forward, heart pounding. Inside lay the evidence that would shatter not just her perfect life, but expose a criminal empire that had been hiding in plain sight all along. But Sarah didn't know that yet. She only knew that her hands were trembling as she lifted the lid, not realizing this moment would soon connect her to a missing woman named Jennifer Dulos and a pattern of violence that was only beginning to unfold. The first thing she saw was a phone, not David's sleek work iPhone or his personal device, but a basic model she'd never seen before. Beneath it lay a stack of children's artwork, the kind proud parents taped to refrigerator doors. Happy Father's Day, Daddy read one card in careful child's handwriting. The date was last summer. Sarah stared at the card, her world tilting on its axis. Last summer, when David was supposedly at a conference in Seattle. Her hands shook as she lifted out a bundle of photographs. In the first image, David sat on an unfamiliar porch, his arm around a dark-haired woman Sarah had never seen. Two children, a boy and a girl, sat at their feet, all smiles and summer tans. They looked comfortable together. Happy. Like family. The sound of a car in the driveway made her freeze. David wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Quickly, she replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, slid the box back into its hiding place. But as she closed the closet door, Sarah knew nothing would ever be the same. She didn't know about Jennifer Dulos yet, or the missing paper towels that would start an investigation. She didn't know about the murders to come, or the criminal web she'd just stumbled into. She only knew that her perfect life had been built on lies, and lies, like bodies, rarely stay buried forever. Sarah knelt in the guest room closet, reaching for a serving platter she hadn't used since last Christmas. That's when her hand brushed against something unfamiliar, a plain brown showbox pushed far into the corner. Not the usual glossy department store variety that filled her walk-in closet, but the kind you'd buy at a discount store. In her home, it was as out of place as a weed in a manicured garden. She pulled it forward, surprised by its weight. The box had no markings, no labels, nothing to suggest its contents. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. In 12 years of marriage, she'd never invaded David's privacy. But something about this box felt wrong, like a splinter under otherwise perfect skin. When she lifted the lid, her world stopped turning. The first thing she saw was a phone, not David's sleek work iPhone or his personal device, but a basic model she'd never seen before. Beneath it lay a stack of children's artwork, the kind proud parents taped to refrigerator doors. Happy Father's Day, Daddy read one card in careful child's handwriting. The date was last summer, a time when David had been away on business. Her hands trembling now, Sarah lifted out a bundle of photographs. In the first image, David sat on an unfamiliar porch, his arm around a dark-haired woman Sarah had never seen. Two children, a boy and a girl, sat at their feet, all smiles and summer tans. They looked comfortable together. Happy. Like family. The other family, the woman's name was Jennifer Lawrence. Sarah learned this through hours of numb online searching, her laptop screen burning bright in the darkened bedroom as evening fell. A pediatric nurse at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. The children were Jacob, age 7, and Emily, 5. Their social media presence told a story of little league games, school plays, and family barbecues. A life taking place in parallel to Sarah's own. Like a mirror universe where David wore jeans instead of suits and coached t-ball instead of attending charity galas. The timestamps on photos tracked a history going back 8 years. 8 years of lies. 8 years of business trips that were really visits to another home, another life, another family. Sarah found herself studying Jennifer's face, looking for something. What? A sign of guilt? Awareness? Was she as much a victim of David's deception as Sarah, or had she known all along that she was the other woman? Bank statements revealed a pattern of transfers to an account in Jennifer's name. Mortgage payments on a modest house in a Columbus suburb. Private school tuition. Little league fees. A paper trail of everyday family life, funded by money Sarah had thought was going into their retirement accounts. Investigation phase, Sarah became a detective in her own life, methodically piecing together the extent of David's deception. The second phone yielded hundreds of text messages, each one a knife to her heart. Good morning messages. Grocery lists. Photos of school events. The ordinary, intimate exchanges of family life. She traced David's movements through credit card statements, matching dates and locations. Columbus charges aligned perfectly with his supposed business trips. Restaurant receipts showed family dinners on nights he'd told Sarah he was stuck in client meetings. Movie tickets for 4 on evenings he'd claimed to be networking at industry events. The digital breadcrumbs led her down darker paths. Hidden email accounts revealed conversations about offshore accounts. Wire transfers to shell companies. Names she didn't recognize attached to large sums of money. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. There was something bigger, something possibly illegal lurking beneath the surface. Social media became another window into the parallel universe. Jennifer's carefully curated posts never mentioned David by name, but he was there in the background of family photos, in references to Daddy's home and family movie night. Sarah found herself scrolling through years of moments, watching another family's happiness built on the foundation of her own marriage's lies. The confrontation. Sarah chose a Friday evening for the confrontation. David was due home from another business trip, one she now knew had been spent at a school play in Columbus. She arranged the evidence on the coffee table like exhibits in a prosecution. The showbox, bank statements, photos laid out in damning chronological order. Her hands trembled as she heard his key in the lock. The familiar sound of his briefcase being set down. His footsteps approaching the living room. Sarah? Why are you sitting in the dark? She reached over and turned on the lamp, illuminating the display before her. David froze in the doorway, his face draining of color as his eyes moved from object to object, taking in the carefully arranged proof of his betrayal. How long were you going to wait to tell me about Jacob and Emily? The name of his other children hung in the air between them. David's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Shock, fear, calculation, and finally settling into something Sarah had never seen before. Something cold. You don't understand, he began, taking a step forward. It's complicated. Explain it to me then. Sarah's voice was surprisingly steady. Explain how you've maintained 2 separate families for 8 years. Explain the offshore accounts. Explain all of it. David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Sarah's heart ache despite everything. I never meant for any of this to happen. Jennifer was pregnant before I knew what was happening. I couldn't just abandon my child. Children, Sarah corrected. Plural. And you didn't just not abandon them. You built a whole life with them. A life you hid from me for 8 years. I needed to protect everyone. You don't know what you're getting into here, Sarah. There are things going on that you don't understand. Something in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl. The man standing before her was not the David she knew, or thought she knew. This stranger wore her husband's face, but his eyes were different. Calculating. Dangerous. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you, he said quietly. Let this go. For your own safety. The implications of that statement hung heavy in the air. Sarah's mind raced back to the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the unexplained transfers. What had she stumbled into? I can't let this go, David. I won't. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned abruptly and walked out. Sarah heard his footsteps retreat, the front door open and close. His car engine started in the driveway. It was the last time she would see him as her husband. The next time their paths crossed, there would be blood on his hands. Sarah sat in the growing darkness, surrounded by the evidence of her shattered life, not knowing that this was only the beginning. In the coming weeks, the true scope of David's deception would emerge, and the body count would start to rise. But in that moment, all she could feel was the hollow echo of her world collapsing, and the creeping fear that she had just set something terrible in motion. Detective Michael Lawson stood in Sarah's living room 5 days after David's disappearance, his weathered face reflecting 20 years of seeing people's lives unravel. He picked up one of the photos from the coffee table. David with his other family, all smiles at a summer barbecue. "And you haven't heard from him since Friday night?" Lawson asked, his deep voice carrying the weight of concern rather than mere professional interest. "Nothing," Sarah replied. "His phone goes straight to voicemail. His office says he hasn't checked in. It's like he just vanished." Lawson nodded, making notes in a small black notebook. At 53, he'd investigated hundreds of missing persons cases, but something about this one felt different. The dual families weren't even the most troubling part. It was the financial documents Sarah had discovered, suggesting something far darker lurking beneath the surface. "Mrs. Thompson, these offshore accounts you mentioned. Can you show me exactly what you found?" As Sarah pulled up the banking records on her laptop, neither of them knew they were about to uncover something far more sinister than a man running from his lies. The investigation began quietly. A missing persons report filed. Interviews with David's colleagues. Standard procedure for a man who might simply be avoiding the consequences of his exposed deception. But then came the first sign that this was anything but standard. Simon Reeves's body was found on a Tuesday morning, sprawled at the bottom of his basement stairs. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. An accident, it seemed, except Simon had been David's closest colleague, and he'd been scheduled to speak with Detective Lawson the next day. "The position is wrong," Lawson muttered, crouching beside the body. If he'd fallen, he wouldn't have landed like this. His flashlight beam caught something else. A faint mark on Reeves's neck, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. The autopsy confirmed Lawson's suspicions. Reeves had been dead before he fell, a sophisticated cocktail of drugs in his system, administered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who wanted it to look like an accident. Sarah learned of Reeves's death from the evening news. She sat on her couch, wine glass trembling in her hand, as the reporter detailed the tragic accident. But she knew better. The night before David disappeared, she'd overheard him arguing with Simon on the phone. "You can't back out now," David had hissed. "You're in too deep. We all are." The investigation shifted gears. Lawson brought in forensic accountants to trace the labyrinth of financial transactions Sarah had discovered. What they found sent ripples through multiple federal agencies. "It's not just money laundering," Agent Rebecca Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit explained to Lawson. They sat in his office, surrounded by whiteboards covered in flowcharts of shell companies and wire transfers. Thompson's company was moving hundreds of millions through these accounts. "This has all the hallmarks of organized crime." The numbers were staggering. David's legitimate business success had been built on a foundation of criminal enterprise. Real estate developments funded with dirty money. Construction contracts used to launder funds for what appeared to be a major criminal organization. Every success Sarah had been proud of was tainted. Then the threats began. The first came as a text from an unknown number. "Your husband made promises. Someone has to keep them." Sarah forwarded it to Lawson, her hands shaking. Within days, there were more. Photos of her leaving work. Notes left on her car. Silent phone calls in the middle of the night. "We need to get you protection," Lawson insisted, but Sarah refused to leave her home. "If David contacts anyone, it'll be here." The media caught wind of the story, and it exploded. "Suburban husband's double life exposed," screamed one headline. "Missing businessman linked to criminal enterprise," declared another. Reporters camped outside Sarah's house, their camera flashes creating a strobe effect in her living room each evening. Jennifer Lawrence and her children were thrust into the spotlight as well. Paparazzi photos showed them being hustled into their Columbus home by police officers, Jennifer's face hidden behind large sunglasses. Sarah watched the coverage with a mixture of sympathy and bitter recognition. Another woman whose life had been shattered by David's lies. The community reaction was swift and divided. Some rallied around Sarah, bringing casseroles and offering support. Others whispered behind their hands at the grocery store, wondering how she couldn't have known, what else she might be hiding. The charity boards she'd sat on quietly asked her to step down. Friends stopped calling. Meanwhile, Lawson's investigation uncovered more disturbing connections. David's company had done business with several firms known to be fronts for organized crime. The offshore accounts linked back to organizations suspected of everything from drug trafficking to human smuggling. "Your husband was their golden boy," Lawson explained to Sarah one evening. "Legitimate businessman, perfect family man, ideal cover for moving their money through the system. Question is, what made him run?" The answer came in the form of surveillance footage from a gas station in western Pennsylvania, 3 days after David's disappearance. The image was grainy but clear enough. David at the counter, paying cash. He looked over his shoulder constantly, fear evident even in the poor-quality video. Behind him, partially visible, was a man in a dark jacket. The next frame showed David hurrying to his car, the man following. "He's not running from us," Lawson realized. "He's running from them." The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a picture more dangerous than anyone had imagined. David Thompson hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been playing a deadly game with some of the most dangerous people in the country. And now, with Simon Reeves's death, it was clear they were cleaning house. Sarah sat in her kitchen late one night, going through more financial documents, when she heard it, a soft scraping at the back door. Her heart stopped. The security system Lawson had insisted she install showed no breaches, but she could have sworn. Her phone lit up with a text, almost time to pay for David's promises. Outside, a car started and drove away slowly. Sarah sat in the darkness, Detective Lawson's card clutched in her hand, realizing that her husband's deceptions had put her in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than a simple scandal. The next morning's paper would carry the story of another death connected to the case, and Sarah would understand that the darkness her husband had invited in was nowhere near finished with their lives. Detective Lawson stood at his evidence board late that night, adding new photos, new connections. Simon Reeves's autopsy photo, surveillance screenshots, financial records. At the center, David Thompson's smiling face from his company portrait, the man who had set it all in motion. Lawson's phone buzzed, another text from his FBI contact. "Second body found. This is bigger than we thought." The detective looked at the photo of Sarah on his board, wondering if he could keep her safe from what was coming. Because one thing was becoming clear. David Thompson's disappearance wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Emma Thompson found the laptop 3 hours before she died. David's sister had been searching his old office files, looking for anything that might help explain her brother's disappearance. Instead, she found something that would get her killed. Detective Lawson got the call at 3:47 a.m. "You need to see this," the responding officer said. "It's different." Emma's apartment looked like a war zone. Books thrown from shelves, furniture overturned, drawers emptied onto the floor. But the violence done to the space paled in comparison to what had been done to Emma. Unlike Simon Reeves's carefully staged accident, this was a message. "They wanted something," Lawson said, crouching beside Emma's body. The bruising on her hands showed she'd fought back. "And they wanted us to know they'd kill to get it." Sarah identified the body, her last connection to David's family now lying cold on a metal table. Emma had been her friend, confidant, the one person who understood what she was going through. Now she was another casualty of David's secrets. "She called me yesterday," Sarah told Lawson, her voice hollow. "Said she'd found something important. She wanted to meet, but needed to check one more thing first." The killer had taken Emma's laptop, but they'd missed something crucial. A small USB drive hidden in a false bottom of her jewelry box. When Lawson plugged it into his secure computer, what they found changed everything. Emma had been methodically documenting her brother's activities for months, long before his disappearance. Bank records, phone logs, surveillance photos she'd taken herself. But most importantly, she'd discovered a pattern in David's real estate developments. "Look at these properties," she'd written in her notes. Every major project coincides with spikes in drug trafficking through the same areas. The construction sites, the cleaning crews, the supply chains, it's all cover for moving product. But Emma had gone further, tracking the organization behind it all. The Callahan Group, a supposedly legitimate investment firm, appeared in connection with every project. Their CEO, Marcus Callahan, showed up in photos at charity events with David, both men smiling for the cameras while their organizations moved millions in dirty money. The investigation led to a cabin in the state park, 50 miles outside the city. Emma's last phone signal had pinged off a tower nearby. When Lawson's team breached the door, they found evidence someone had been living there recently: food wrappers, a makeshift bed, and most importantly, walls covered in newspaper clippings about the case. "He was here," Lawson said, studying a coffee cup with lipstick on the rim. And he wasn't alone. Hidden under a loose floorboard, they found Emma's laptop. The killer had missed it in their hurry to escape. Its contents confirmed their worst fears. David hadn't just been laundering money for the Callahan Group. He'd been gathering evidence against them, building a case for when he finally turned state's witness. The organization's structure emerged from Emma's research like a spider's web. Marcus Callahan at the center, his legitimate business empire hiding a massive criminal enterprise. David had been one of several cleaned businessmen used to move money and product, each operating independently, none knowing the full scope of the operation. But David had gotten greedy, skimming from the laundered funds, thinking he could play both sides. When Callahan found out, David ran. But not before collecting enough evidence to bring down the entire organization. "That's why they killed Emma," Lawson explained to Sarah. "She was getting too close to the truth. And now they're cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might know where David hid the evidence." The impact on the families was devastating. In Columbus, Jennifer took the children and disappeared into witness protection, their home standing empty as a testament to another life destroyed by David's choices. Jacob and Emily, David's other children, would grow up looking over their shoulders, their identities erased, their childhood memories tainted by the knowledge that their father had put them all in danger. Sarah watched her own life crumble in slow motion. Friends stopped calling, afraid of being associated with the scandal. Her firm put her on indefinite leave, concerned about the attention she brought. She became a prisoner in her own home, jumping at every sound, wondering if each night would be the night Callahan's people came for her. The community that had once celebrated the Thompsons now treated them like a cautionary tale. Whispers followed Sarah at the grocery store. Parents pulled their children away when she passed. The charity boards she'd served on scrubbed her name from their websites. How could she not have known? They whispered. She must have been involved. Detective Lawson watched it all unfold, knowing the worst was yet to come. Emma's murder had escalated everything. If David had been gathering evidence against Callahan, where was it now? And how many more people would die before they found it? The answer came in an unexpected way. A young officer processing Emma's apartment found something overlooked in the initial search: a receipt for a storage unit rented 3 days before her death. When they opened the unit, they found boxes of files, hard drives, and most importantly, a detailed letter from David. "If you're reading this," it began, "I'm either dead or running. Everything here is insurance, proof of what Callahan's been doing, where the money goes, who's involved. Emma, I'm trusting you to know what to do with it. But be careful. These people will kill to keep their secrets." David's warning had come too late for Emma, but his evidence opened up new avenues of investigation. The FBI's organized crime unit took over, working alongside Lawson's team. The scope of Callahan's operation stunned even veteran investigators. "It's not just drugs," Agent Chen explained, spreading photos across Lawson's desk. "Human trafficking, arms dealing, political bribes. David's companies were just one part of a massive criminal enterprise." Sarah sat in Lawson's office, looking at photos of her husband with Marcus Callahan. Charity galas, golf outings, family barbecues, all while they moved millions in dirty money through legitimate businesses. Was any of it real? She wondered aloud. Any of what we had? Lawson had no answer for her. He was too busy wondering where David was, and whether he was still alive to testify about what he knew. That night, as Sarah sat alone in her too large house, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Her heart stopped when she opened it. A photo of David, clearly recent, bound to a chair. Blood ran down his face. The message below was simple. He says you have something we want. Time to make a trade. Sarah stared at her phone, Detective Lawson's card in her other hand, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The body count wasn't done rising, and the next name on the list might be her own. The call came at 3:17 a.m. Sarah stared at the unknown number lighting up her phone, her heart pounding. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail. But she knew. Somehow she knew. Sarah. David's voice was barely recognizable, ragged and desperate. Don't hang up. She sat frozen in her darkened kitchen, Detective Lawson's warning echoing in her head. If he makes contact, keep him talking, trace the call. Her finger hovered over the emergency alert app Lawson had installed. Where are you? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, surprisingly steady. I need to see you. Just you. I can explain everything. A pause, filled with ragged breathing. They're going to kill me, Sarah. Maybe they already have. You're not making sense. David. The old Millbrook factory. Come alone. 1 hour. His voice cracked. Please. I owe you the truth. The line went dead. Sarah's hands shook as she called Lawson, knowing what she had to do. Within 30 minutes, an operation was in motion. We'll have teams covering every entrance, Lawson explained, helping Sarah into a bulletproof vest. But you'll appear to be alone. If he's being watched, they'll only see you. And if it's a trap? Lawson's face was grim. That's what we're counting on. The Millbrook factory loomed against the pre-dawn sky, its abandoned hulk a testament to better days. Sarah's footsteps echoed on broken concrete as she approached the main entrance, every shadow seeming to hold potential threats. Movement on the second floor crackled the nearly invisible earpiece she wore. Single figure, male. The interior was a maze of rust and shadows. Broken machinery created twisted silhouettes in the weak light filtering through dirty windows. Sarah followed the path of recently disturbed dust, her heart thundering in her ears. She found David in what had once been an office. He sat slumped in a corner, blood matting his hair on one side. The successful businessman she'd married was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger in torn, dirty clothes. You came. He looked past her, scanning the shadows. Are you alone? Like you are? Sarah kept her distance. Or are Callahan's people watching? A bitter laugh escaped him. They're always watching. But they're giving me this chance. One chance to get back what I took. The evidence Emma found. David's face contorted at his sister's name. I never meant. She wasn't supposed to get involved. None of you were. Tell that to Simon Reeves's family. Tell that to your children. Both sets of them. You don't understand. I was building something. Something legitimate. Something real. But I needed capital. Callahan offered a solution. His words came faster now, desperate. Just move some money through the developments. Clean investments. Everyone wins. Until you got greedy. I saw an opportunity. Skimmed a little, here and there. Built my cushion. My insurance. He laughed again, the sound edging toward hysteria. Callahan found out. But by then, I had enough evidence to bring down his whole operation. Deadman's switch. If anything happens to me, everything goes to the FBI. Movement in the shadows caught Sarah's attention. David saw it too, his eyes widening. You didn't come alone. Neither did you. The factory erupted in chaos. FBI teams crashed through windows and doors. Shots echoed off metal walls. David lunged forward, pulling a gun from his jacket. I can't go to prison, he shouted over the noise. I won't survive a day. Sarah saw his finger tighten on the trigger. David, don't. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. David crumpled, blood blooming on his chest. But he hadn't pulled the trigger. The shot had come from behind him. Marcus Callahan stepped from the shadows, his expensive suit incongruous in the decrepit setting. Sorry to crash the reunion. His smile was cold as he aimed the gun at Sarah. Now, about that evidence. Multiple red dots appeared on Callahan's chest, sniper sights. FBI, drop your weapon. What followed was a blur of motion and sound. Callahan spun, firing. Return fire lit up the darkness. Sarah felt hands pulling her to safety as the factory filled with shouts and the thunder of gunfire. When it was over, Callahan lay dead, along with 3 of his men. David, somehow still alive, was rushed to surgery. The evidence he'd gathered, combined with Emma's research, provided everything needed to dismantle the organization. The takedown made national news. Crime empire falls, declared the headlines. Suburban businessman exposes massive criminal enterprise. Over the next week, arrests were made across 5 states. Politicians resigned. Business empires crumbled. The scope of Callahan's operation stunned the public. Sarah watched it unfold from David's hospital room, where he lay handcuffed to the bed, hovering between life and death. She wasn't sure why she stayed. Duty, closure, or something else she couldn't name. Jennifer arrived on the 3rd day, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared pain and understanding. She didn't stay long, just long enough to let David know the children were safe. Sarah wondered if, like her, Jennifer was hoping for answers that David might never be able to give. He'll survive, Lawson told them both. Face charges for money laundering, conspiracy, accessory to murder. But his testimony will bring down what's left of Callahan's organization. The media camped outside the hospital, hungry for every detail. They painted David as both villain and whistleblower, tragic figure and criminal mastermind. The truth, Sarah knew, was more complicated. Late one night, when the medication had worn down David's defenses, he finally told her everything. How it started small, one favor for Callahan, then another. How the money became addictive. How meeting Jennifer hadn't been planned, but the second family became another kind of addiction. A chance to be someone else, someone unburdened by the weight of his choices. I loved you both, he whispered. That part was real. Maybe the only real thing. Sarah stood, gathering her purse. Goodbye, David. It wasn't forgiveness. She wasn't sure she'd ever manage that. But it was an ending, of sorts. Or maybe a beginning. Outside, the city was waking up. News vans still crowded the hospital parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the lightening sky. Sarah walked past them, ignoring the shouted questions. Her phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer. The kids are asking questions. When you're ready, maybe we could talk. Sarah stared at the message, thinking of all the lives changed by David's choices. The ripples would go on for years, 2 families forever linked by betrayal and tragedy, children growing up in the shadow of their father's crimes. But perhaps there was hope in the wreckage. A chance for truth, if not healing. A way forward through the darkness David had brought into all their lives. Detective Lawson waited by her car. You okay? Sarah looked back at the hospital, where her husband lay paying for his crimes, then at her phone, where Jennifer's message offered a tentative bridge between 2 shattered families. No, she said honestly. But I will be. 18 months after the shootout at Millbrook factory, Sarah sat in the federal courthouse, watching her husband accept his fate. David Thompson, once the pinnacle of success and respectability, now stood hollow-eyed in an orange jumpsuit. The defendant will rise, Judge Marshall intoned. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah felt Jennifer's presence 2 rows behind her, both women united in their need to see this through to the end. David Thompson, this court has found you guilty of money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to multiple homicides. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say? David turned slightly, his eyes finding both his wives in the gallery. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely carrying. Not for getting caught, but for the lives I destroyed. My children. They deserved better. The judge's voice was granite. 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for 18 years. The sentence fell like a gavel, final and irreversible. Sarah watched David being led away, remembering the man who had charmed her at that Yale mixer so many years ago. Had he been wearing a mask even then? The trial had exposed everything. Week after week, Prosecutors laid bare the extent of Callahan's operation, with David's companies at the center. The evidence Emma had died protecting proved devastating. 15 high-ranking members of the organization received life sentences. 38 corrupt officials were indicted. Over $2 billion in assets were seized. But statistics couldn't capture the human cost. Sarah found Jennifer waiting outside the courthouse. They'd developed an unlikely bond, meeting regularly to navigate the aftermath of David's deceptions. The kids? Sarah asked. Back in school in Ohio. New names, new start. Jennifer's smile was tired but genuine. Jacob made the baseball team. They walked together, two women rebuilding lives from the wreckage of shared betrayal. Their story had become something of a media fascination. The wives who formed a friendship in the ashes of their husbands' crimes. I'm selling the house, Sarah announced. Too many ghosts. Jennifer nodded understanding. She'd already moved her family, using part of the settlement money from seized assets to start fresh. The children were in therapy, learning to process their father's betrayal. Emily had stopped asking when Daddy was coming home. The healing process was different for everyone. Sarah had thrown herself into advocacy work, starting a foundation to support families affected by white-collar crime. The woman who had once lived for charity galas now found purpose in helping others rebuild shattered lives. Detective Lawson's investigation officially closed with David's sentencing, but questions lingered. Some of Callahan's assets remained unaccounted for. Certain connections were never fully explained. The detective kept a board in his office, tracking loose ends. Cases like this don't end neat and clean, he told Sarah over coffee. There's always another layer, another connection we missed. The community struggled to process the scandal. The country club set that had once embraced the Thompsons now dissected every interaction, looking for signs they'd missed. Sarah's former friends divided into camps. Those who offered genuine support and those who treated her like she carried a contagious disease. But there were surprises. Emma's former co-workers established a scholarship in her name. Simon Reeves's widow reached out to Sarah, sharing memories of their husbands in happier times. Small acts of kindness emerged from the tragedy. The case changed things beyond personal lives. New regulations were enacted for real estate developments. Banks strengthened their money laundering protocols. The FBI established a task force specifically targeting crime organizations using legitimate businesses as covers. Sarah visited David once, 6 months into his sentence. He'd aged decades in that short time. Why did you really do it? She asked. Was it just about the money? I wanted more, he said simply. More success, more life, more everything. Then I couldn't stop. Every lie needed another lie to support it. She left without looking back. The children's trust funds, untouched by asset seizure, ensured their futures. Sarah made sure Jennifer had access to resources for their education. It was a small redemption, ensuring David's children wouldn't suffer financially for his crimes. 1 year to the day after the sentencing, Sarah stood at Emma's grave. Detective Lawson joined her, bringing coffee and updates on the case's ripple effects. The Callahan investigation led to 3 more organizations being exposed, he shared. Your husband's evidence is still paying dividends. He's not my husband anymore, Sarah corrected gently. The divorce had been finalized months ago. They stood in comfortable silence, honoring the woman who died pursuing truth. Emma's death had not been in vain. Her research had helped bring down an empire of corruption. The media eventually moved on to new scandals, but the case left lasting marks. Books were written, documentaries produced. The story became a cautionary tale about the seduction of wealth and the price of deception. Sarah found herself increasingly at peace. She'd started dating again, cautiously. Her foundation was making real differences in people's lives. The nightmares came less frequently. Jennifer and the children visited occasionally. Watching Jacob and Emily play in her backyard, Sarah felt a bittersweet connection to these innocent victims of David's choices. They would always be a reminder of what was lost, but also of the resilience of the human spirit. Detective Lawson retired the following spring, but not before solving one final mystery. Hidden in Emma's research was evidence of additional accounts, money David had secretly set aside for his children. It wasn't tainted funds, legitimate earnings he'd saved, perhaps his one truly selfless act. On a warm evening 5 years after David's arrest, Sarah hosted a dinner. Jennifer was there with the children, now teenagers. Simon Reeves's widow brought her new husband. Detective Lawson, retired but still sharp, told old stories. They were an unlikely family, forged in tragedy but choosing to move forward together. After dinner, Sarah found Jacob, so like his father at that age, looking at old photos. Was he always bad? The boy asked. Sarah considered carefully. People are complicated, she said finally. Your father did terrible things, but he loved you. Both those things can be true. As her guests departed, Sarah stood in her new home's doorway, watching them go. The weight of the past felt lighter somehow. She had survived, adapted, grown. They all had. The final piece of mail from her old house arrived that week. A letter from David, written in prison. She considered burning it unread, but something made her open it. I know I can never make it right, he'd written. But watching you all build something positive from my destruction gives me hope. Maybe that's my real legacy, not the man who destroyed 2 families, but the catalyst for something stronger rising from the ashes. Sarah placed the letter in a box with other memories of that time. Photos, news clippings, Emma's final notes. The past couldn't be changed, but it could teach, could heal, could transform. That night, she wrote in her journal, as she had every night since David's arrest. But for the first time, she found herself writing about the future instead of the past. About hope instead of betrayal. About the family she'd found in the aftermath of destruction. Sometimes, she realized, the truth doesn't set you free so much as show you who you really are. And sometimes, that's enough.